Human Rights Commission hearing on Burma human rights in the aftermath of the coup will come to order. I want to welcome everybody here. This is the Rules Committee. This is the traffic cop of Congress. All bills come through the Rules Committee. We meet the oldest committee in the Congress. Meet more than any other committee. The problem is the room's too damn small. But in any event, we'll try to accommodate people. If you don't mind just shutting the door, oh, no, not shutting you out. Yeah, you come in, yeah, that's it, yeah, okay. But good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's hearing on human rights in Burma in the aftermath of the February 1, 2021 coup d'etat. I want to thank our witnesses for taking the time to share their expertise with us, and I look forward to our discussion. We have convened this hearing because 2.5 years after the coup, the human rights situation in Burma has only continued to deteriorate. A return to democracy does not seem to be on the horizon, while the world's attention has shifted to other crises. We have one question today: whether we in Congress, in the Biden administration, and in the international community are doing all that we can to be wind at the backs of those fighting for human rights and to restore democracy in Burma. This commission has been engaged on human rights in Burma since it was created in 2008. One of the first hearings I led as co-chair was on human rights abuses in Burma in April 2009, and we've convened several other hearings and briefings since then. I wish I could say that the human rights situation had improved during those years. For a brief moment, when the National League for Democracy, or NLD, won a sweeping victory in 2015, in the 2015 parliamentary elections, and went on to form a government led by Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi, hopes for a rights-respecting democratic transition were high after decades of military rule. But those hopes were quickly tempered by the reality of the Tatmadaws' continued political power, and then completely undercut by the horrific campaign that forced more than 800,000 Rohingya to flee for their lives in 2016 and 2017. The government's inability or unwillingness to protect the Rohingya was gut-wrenching, a terrible delusion, and did not placate the military. When the November 2020 election rolled around, the Tatmadaw was simply unwilling to tolerate the NLD's second big victory, and so the coup, with its devastating consequences. Nearly 3,700 people killed, 17,000 still detained, 60,000 homes burned, and more than 1.6 million newly displaced. Those democratic leaders not imprisoned are in hiding or exiled, and civil war has spread throughout the country. According to the State Department's 2022 country reports on human rights, the military has repeatedly used lethal force against peaceful protesters, waged offensives, including with airstrikes against ethnic minority militias, and committed a wide range of extremely grave human rights violations, including targeted killings, systematic burning of villages, and sexual violence. An estimated 17.6 million people, nearly a third of the population, needs humanitarian assistance. To the extent that there is any good news, it's that the military's brutal repression is unifying people across ethnic lines in opposition to military rule. The Biden administration has said that the United States will not waver in its support for the people of Burma as they seek peace, justice, and a genuine democratic future for their country. Immediately after the coup, President Biden issued Executive Order 14014, which authorized sanctions against those who undermine democratic processes or institutions in Burma and against military leaders of the coup government. As of this month, OFAC has designated 127 persons for sanctions pursuant to Executive Order 14014 authority, including 83 individuals and 44 entities. And I take this opportunity to express my strong support for these designations. The United States response has not been limited to sanctions. The administration has worked to coordinate a multilateral response to the crisis through the United Nations and has engaged with ASEAN and regional partners. It has stated clearly that conditions do not exist for free and fair elections next year. The State Department has made Burma a priority country for its strategy to anticipate, prevent, and mitigate atrocities in keeping with the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act. Last December, Congress passed the Burma Unified Through Rigorous Military Accountability Act, or Burma Act, as it's known, as part of the FY 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, and its implementation is underway. So today's discussion is an opportunity to take stock of what has been done and ask what has been achieved, how we know if we're making progress, and what more can we do. During the preparations for this hearing, some recommendations have already come our way: greater emphasis on building civil society capacity for the long run, localization of humanitarian assistance, increasing pressure on the military's economic base, pursuing accountability through all available channels, and I hope we can discuss these ideas and more during the course of this hearing. I'm now happy to yield to our distinguished co-chair, Congressman Chris Smith, for his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this very important hearing. The military junta governing this country is certainly one of the most brutal dictatorships and repressive governments in the entire world. We must continue to call for an end to the savage persecution of the Rohingya people and other religious minorities, and the release of thousands of political prisoners, respect for freedom of speech, and the restoration of the parliament elected in 2020. You know, as the prime author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, I'd like to focus at least some of my comments, and perhaps our distinguished witnesses could speak to the issue of human trafficking. And our former co-chair of this was the prime author of the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, Frank Wolf. So I'd also like to raise the issue of religious persecution and the complete lack of religious freedom in Burma. In the fight against human trafficking, Burma, again this year, was placed as a Tier 3 country, meaning that according to the 2023 TIP report, Burma does not fully meet the minimum standards for elimination of trafficking and is not making significant efforts to do so. And of course, when you read the narrative and when you look at what's happening on the ground, that is even an understatement. It is awful. The Burmese government is a military dictatorship which took power in a coup in February of 2021. The Burmese military itself engages in human trafficking through the use of children and adults for forced labor. Since the 2021 coup, efforts to combat trafficking continued to decline, the report points out, dramatically after the coup, as the military regime shifted its focus away from justice sector priorities and toward persecution of the pro-democracy opposition. The regime did not report any law enforcement action whatsoever against military or deposed civilian government officials for complicity in human trafficking, despite continued regular reports of such complicity. Nor, according to the TIP report, has the government taken any steps to reduce child sex tourism, one of the most reprehensive aspects of human trafficking. It's all awful, but to abuse a child in such a cruel and degrading and perverse way is beyond the pale, and yet they do it systematically. On religious freedom, Burma has been listed by the United States Department of State as a country of particular concern, or CPC country, and that means they're the worst of the worst. And it's been on that list every year since the year after the bill or the law was signed into law that was authored again by Frank Wolf since 1999. The standard here is that the government engages in or tolerates particularly severe violations of religious freedom. Once again, the government itself is the culprit. The State Department documents that its soldiers destroyed a Baptist church, they stormed a Catholic cathedral compound, and it confines over 100,000 Muslim Rohingya in camps and jails many more others, some 2,000 individuals. It's responsible for massive rights violations against Muslims and Christians in several of the Burmese states. Obviously, our government does not have a good, close working relationship. The sanctions obviously are helpful, and like our distinguished co-chair, I fully support what you've done, and I'm grateful. But we all have to figure out what more can we all do. Yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, we welcome our distinguished panel. We have three panels, and let me begin with panel number one. First of all, Melissa A. Brown, the Deputy Assistant Secretary with responsibility for the Office of Mainland Southeast Asia Affairs and the Office of Maritime Southeast Asia Affairs in the U.S. Department of State. From 2019 to 2021, Ms. Brown served as the Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. mission to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in Jakarta, Indonesia, where she led an expansion of U.S. engagement as well as efforts to mobilize the Association of Southeast Asian Nations to resolve the political crisis in Burma. She is a graduate of Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service and grew up in New Jersey. That's where you're from, right? And in Jakarta, Indonesia. Michael Schiffer is the Assistant Administrator of the Bureau of Asia for the U.S. Agency for International Development. From 2012 to 2022, Mr. Schiffer was a Senior Advisor and Counselor on the Democratic staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. From 2009 to 2012, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia and the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Affairs. He's received his undergraduate degree from Georgetown University and graduate degrees from the London School of Economics and New York University. Erin Barclay is the Acting Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and the Coordinator for Global Democratic Renewal in the Office of the Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Human Rights, and Democracy in the U.S. Department of State. From September 6, 2022 to January 2nd, 2023, she was the Senior Bureau Official for the DRL Bureau. Prior to joining the department, she was the Executive Director of the Network of East-West Women, a nonprofit organization that promotes women's human rights in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. She's a graduate of State University of New York at Binghamton and the University of Buffalo School of Law, and is an attorney admitted to the New York State and District of Columbia. Dr. Beth Van Schaak is the Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice, GCJ, at the U.S. Department of State. In this role, she advises the Secretary of State and other department leadership on issues related to the prevention of and response to atrocity crimes, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Ambassador Van Schaak served as deputy to the Ambassador at Large at GCJ from 2012 to 2013. Early in her career, she was a practicing lawyer, and she worked with the Center for Justice and Accountability, a human rights law firm, and the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunals for Rwanda and former Yugoslavia in The Hague. She's a graduate of Stanford, BA, Yale, JD, and Leiden, PhD universities. So anyway, this is a very distinguished and well-informed panel, and I want to welcome you here. And Ms. Brown, we'll begin with you.
Great, thank you. It is my honor to speak to you today on the administration's Burma policy and on our approach to addressing the human rights situation that has rapidly deteriorated, as you noted, since the military seized power in a coup d'etat in February 2021. Since the coup, Burma's military regime has escalated its brutality against the people of Burma, those who aspire for a more inclusive and democratic future for their country. It has killed thousands of men, women, and children, conducted airstrikes that have destroyed schools, concerts, and places of worship, and internally displaced over 1.6 million civilians. The worsening situation in Burma represents a serious human rights crisis and increasingly a threat to regional stability. The administration remains deeply committed to resolving the crisis in Burma to return the country to a path toward an inclusive federal democracy, one that respects human rights. We appreciate the strong bipartisan support in Congress, and we welcome the Burma Act in particular as a valuable tool to advance this goal. Today, I'd like to focus on two key lines of effort in our Burma policy. First, economic and political pressure on the regime, and second, multilateral diplomacy. To resolve the crisis in Burma, we must push Burma's military regime to reverse course. Sanctions are an important tool to promote accountability and inflict high costs on the regime for its human rights abuses and atrocities. Since the coup, we have imposed sanctions on numerous leaders of the military-led State Administration Council. We have intensified our focus on key income streams that fund the regime's repression. In June, we designated 2 state-owned financial institutions that have been at the very center of the military regime's weapon procurement and revenue generation. Just last month, the Department of Treasury strengthened and expanded its use of Burma-related sanctions authorities by issuing a determination that allows sanctions to be imposed on any foreign individual or entity that operates in the jet fuel sector of Burma's economy. Furthermore, we impose sanctions on the leadership of the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise, MOGI. We will continue to intensify actions in these areas. Our sanctions against the state-owned banks, Myanmar Foreign Trade Bank and Myanmar Investment Commercial Bank, quote, hit the bullseye, in the words of pro-democracy leaders. The designations of the state-owned banks are severely restricting the regime's access to foreign currency, and they eliminated a channel used to purchase weapons. We are fully prepared to intensify actions in these areas if the regime continues to inflict violence and repression on its own people. The attacks and violence must stop. The United States has led coordination of sanctions actions with our allies and our partners, including the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and the European Union, among others. This spring, the State Department Sanctions Coordinator, Jim O'Brien, convened a high-level meeting with counterparts to ensure a unified approach, and our teams continue to consult regularly. We recognize we must do more to deprive the military regime of financial resources. We are carefully reviewing our options to deny the regime these funds while mitigating the unintended consequences on the people of Burma and on our allies and partners. In addition to economic pressure, diplomacy, of course, is key to isolating the regime and denying it international credibility. In our high-level engagements, Burma remains high on the agenda. President Biden underscored the importance of democracy in Burma during the ASEAN-related summits in Cambodia last year. Vice President Harris, of course, did the same in Indonesia just earlier this month. Secretary of State Blinken, Counselor Cholet, and other members of our leadership continue to conduct intense diplomacy on Burma, including with Indonesia as the ASEAN chair. We engage with ASEAN member states collectively and individually to ensure Burma's military regime bears a cost for its lack of meaningful action on the ASEAN 5-point consensus. We welcomed ASEAN's decision to exclude the regime from leader-level and some ministerial-level meetings, and also to deny the opportunity for Burma to chair ASEAN in 2026. We are also leveraging the United Nations, as you mentioned, to advance our priorities. Along with our partners, we secured the first-ever UN Security Council resolution on the situation in Burma just last December. Last month, 13 of the 15 UN Security Council members released a joint statement calling for the use of all tools at the Council's disposal to support a peaceful resolution in Burma. We are also advocating for implementation of the General Assembly's call for member states to prevent the flow of arms to Burma. Chairman, members, I thank you very much for Congress's generous support to the people of Burma. We value our partnership that we have on this very challenging issue. We certainly can agree that there are no easy solutions, but I can assure you that the people of Burma will remember for decades to come that the U.S. government, including Congress, came to their aid in their time of need. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Schiffer.
Co-Chair McGovern, Co-Chair Smith, distinguished commission members, thank you for inviting me here today to testify on how the United States Agency for International Development, along with our partners at the Department of State and across the U.S. government, are working to ensure that we support the people of Burma in their efforts to find a peaceful and just resolution to the current crisis, one that is rooted in the will of the people of Burma and their ongoing struggle for an inclusive, democratic future, federalist future for their country. Over 2 years ago, the military seized power in Burma in a bloody coup. The junta has left Burma in ruins, with 4 out of every 5 townships in Burma affected by armed clashes between the military and those that oppose its rule. Today, due to the military's brutality, there are over 1.9 million people displaced in Burma and nearly 1 million refugees in Bangladesh and Thailand. The internally displaced communities are facing increased threats of violence from the military and facing ongoing trauma due to a conflict, a bungled COVID response, epic mismanagement of the economy, high food prices, and frequent displacement that has severely impacted the coping mechanisms of the internally displaced communities. Their vulnerability is further exacerbated by exposure to high-risk natural hazards like the recent cyclone Mocha that has only compounded humanitarian needs. To respond to this humanitarian crisis, USAID has led the international community's humanitarian response to Burma and the Rohingya refugee crisis in Bangladesh and across the region. USAID has provided more than $2.1 billion since 2017, when the military's genocide and crimes against humanity towards the Rohingya led 740,000 Rohingya to flee to neighboring Bangladesh. We deliver humanitarian assistance to the displaced, conflict-afflicted, and other vulnerable groups by leveraging our partnerships with humanitarian organizations that deliver assistance to beneficiaries based on verifiable need. And although at times this work has required engagement at the technical level with governing authorities in Burma, we do so with humanitarian principles first and foremost in mind. In Bangladesh, USAID supports UN agencies and NGO partners to strengthen emergency preparedness and the response capacity of host communities in Cox's Bazar district, including funding for humanitarian coordination, nutrition, protection, and risk management. Additionally, USAID supports the World Food Program and UNICEF to provide emergency food and nutrition assistance to refugees from Burma in Bangladesh. In addition to these efforts to support the people of Burma through our humanitarian assistance programs, immediately following the coup, USAID's bilateral democracy assistance program pivoted to provide emergency support to pro-democracy activists and ethnic support organizations, civil society leaders, journalists, and human rights defenders. This ongoing assistance provides a critical safety net and includes temporary safe houses, subsistence living expenses, emergency medical needs, digital and physical security, legal aid, and psychosocial support, all of which are critical to enabling individual and entities to continue their work for an inclusive federal and democratic future for their country. USAID has also identified priorities that, with additional resources from Congress, would further meet immediate needs and support the enabling environment for a future inclusive federal and democratic Burma. These priorities include supporting the growth of federal and administrative governance structures for the national unity government and the ethnic armed organizations, supporting human rights documentation, strengthening alternative justice and governance systems, and supporting independent media to counter misinformation, as well as with working with grassroots organizations in Rakhine and other ethnic communities to support social cohesion and inclusion. Since the passage of the Burma Act, USAID has further aligned and accelerated programs to support a wide array of actors in Burma. This consists of democracy activists, EAOs and ethnic support groups, human rights defenders, the civil disobedience movement, civil society actors, women and youth groups, the NUG and NUCC, and others. Our support of these groups has benefited from consultations with Congress, both immediately after the coup and in development and implementation of the Burma Act, and we look forward to your additional guidance here today. We have leveraged our democracy and governance budget as the focal point of our aid for these groups, while also using economic development and health programs to deliver basic services and humanitarian aid in order to sustain the resilience of vulnerable conflict-affected communities. USAID Burma has provided this assistance mainly via local civil society and ethnic service delivery organizations. This work also bolsters the enabling environment necessary for a future inclusive democracy. We are, moreover, moving forward with additional interventions to provide non-lethal atrocity prevention and civil protection efforts consistent with the Burma Act. As I'm sure members of this commission can appreciate, given the sensitivity of this work and the need to protect our partners, we would be happy to discuss this specific work on civilian protection and atrocity prevention in greater detail in a different setting. While USAID's work in Burma is uniquely designed for this operating context, we are redoubling our efforts to identify lessons learned from operations in Sudan, Iraq, and other countries with complex operating environments, which have presented similar conflict zone operational challenges. I wish that I was joining you here today to provide a clear roadmap ahead for Burma, one in which the fundamental rights of all the people of Burma are fully protected. That is a goal that USAID shares with members of this commission. But as you well know, the road ahead remains challenging. Nevertheless, USAID remains committed to provide the people of Burma with the support they need during this crisis, prioritizing humanitarian assistance, civilian protection, including early warning and early response, and supporting the growth and development of governance institutions that advance the U.S. policy objectives of a just, peaceful, inclusive, and federal democratic Burma. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Barclay.
Co-Chairman Smith, Co-Chairman McGovern, distinguished members of the Commission, thank you for the opportunity to testify about the state of human rights in Burma. We appreciate this opportunity to shine a light on the troubling human rights violations and abuses committed by this brutal regime. More than 2.5 years following the February 2021 military coup, Burma faces a growing human rights crisis that has undone much of its hard-fought progress towards democracy since 2011. The military regime has suspended many civil liberties under a prolonged state of emergency, declaring another 6-month extension in July, despite reaching the constitutional limit for such extensions earlier this year. The regime also introduced a range of new laws that unduly restrict freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. The regime has impeded internet access, including access to social media platforms, banned independent media outlets, and imprisoned at least 42 journalists, the third highest number of imprisoned journalists globally as of 2022, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. The military junta has targeted prominent leaders in the democracy movement, especially women and girls, through tech-facilitated violence. In one case, a prominent democracy activist had private images and her home address leaked by those loyal to the junta. DRL continues to receive credible reporting of gross human rights violations committed by the regime across Burma, including those involving extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, torture, and sexual violence. The military junta has used gender-based violence, including sexual violence, to terrorize women and girls for decades, and they have escalated this tactic since the 2021 coup. Survivors report a range of violence, including rape, gang rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment, and as you said, Mr. Co-Chairman, human trafficking, the majority of which are committed by security forces, especially the military. Civil society activists say that women are most vulnerable when held alone during interrogation, enabling the police and military to act without witnesses. And these are only the cases that become public. The Assistance Association for Political Prisoners, a non-governmental human rights documentation organization, reports that nearly 4,000 people have been killed by the military regime since the coup, and more than 24,000 arrested, including deposed President Win Myint and State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi, though the actual numbers are likely far higher. In early August, the military regime commuted the sentences of 7,749 prisoners as part of a mass pardoning, but only 120 of those were political prisoners. Despite receiving pardons, the majority of the charges for both President Myint and Aung San Suu Kyi were sustained, and they still face years of imprisonment. We continue to call for their release, as well as all of those unjustly detained in Burma. Many former detainees allege torture and other ill treatment during their detention, and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has found that at least 273 people have died in police or military custody since the coup. The military regime's increasing use of airstrikes has also had a devastating impact on local communities, leading to further displacement. An April 11th airstrike that killed at least 170 people and injured dozens more, including women and children, is but one recent example of the regime's complete disregard for human life in its quest to consolidate control. The multifaceted crisis in Burma has required us to take a comprehensive response that addresses both the immediate human rights challenges facing the people of Burma and the longer-term goal of establishing genuine and inclusive multi-party democracy. We're doing this in several ways. First, consistent with the Burma Act, the Biden administration is working to expand support to pro-democracy actors to develop atrocity prevention tools in response to the military regime's violence. We continue to draw attention to these abuses, as Das Brown said, at the UN and with our like-minded partners to galvanize international efforts to promote accountability for the regime's brutality and to take action to prevent the regime from carrying out further violence. Second, together with our interagency partners, DRL is working to strengthen the resilience of civil society and the pro-democracy movement to advance an inclusive, rights-respecting, and democratic future in Burma. Since February 2021, DRL has provided financial assistance to over 1,000 human rights defenders and civil society advocates, both inside and outside Burma, to enable them to continue their critical work amid sustained harassment and threats. DRL is also providing critical assistance and capacity-building support to civil society organizations and other pro-democracy actors to promote respect for and protect human rights. The pro-democracy movement's needs are vast, and DRL partners routinely propose opportunities to provide assistance beyond current funding levels. Third, we also continue to engage closely with representatives from across civil society and the pro-democracy movement including members of ethnic organizations, human rights defenders, labor organizers, religious actors, the National Unity Government, the National Unity Consultative Council, and the committee representing the Union Parliament. Finally, we continue to bolster our efforts to promote justice and accountability for both past and ongoing human rights abuses, and Ambassador von Schaack will speak, I'm sure, more about that. We have at the same time increased our support for the independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar, provided the Gambia information in connection with its genocide case on behalf of the OIC against Burma at the ICJ, and are supporting processes in a range of other countries to help ensure that those responsible are held to account. Chairman and members, we genuinely thank you for Congress's continued concern about human rights violations and abuses inside Burma and support for the people of Burma and the lines of effort I've laid out. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Van Schaak.
Co-Chairman Smith, Co-Chairman McGovern, thank you so much for allowing us to come and testify before you about the situation in Burma and the prospects for peace, justice, and accountability. Thank you for convening this very timely hearing on a country that has experienced political turmoil and human rights abuses for decades. As we've already discussed, the current military regime and previous governments are responsible for atrocities against civilians, and no government has shown any inclination to pursue justice and accountability for these abuses. This persistent impunity has emboldened the current military regime, which continues to wage a campaign of violence against the civilians, including those peaceably advocating for change and for pursuing a more promising democratic future. In the face of such violence, the world is increasingly united around the imperative of justice and accountability, and the institutional framework for delivering justice is increasingly decentralized and multipolar. There's now a community of courts that is responding to demands from justice, from survivors, their communities, their advocates, and supportive governments. I visited Cox's Bazar in February of last year and heard firsthand from Rohingya refugees about their hopes for the future. Notwithstanding everything they have experienced, they still have faith that the international community will deliver justice. As a result of developments in this field, multiple pathways for justice and accountability now exist for genocide, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing committed against Rohingya by members of Burma's military. These pathways include the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and domestic courts around the world that are able to exercise jurisdiction. In 2019, the Gambia in West Africa, with encouragement from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, brought a case against Burma under the Genocide Convention before the International Court of Justice. The United States applauds this initiative. We have shared relevant information with the Gambia as it presses its claims, and we have welcomed the OIC's support for the Gambia as it confronts a regime intent on genocide and crimes against humanity against a mostly Muslim ethnic religious minority. The ICC, International Criminal Court investigation, is looking at atrocities committed against Rohingya who fled to neighboring Bangladesh, which is itself a state party to the founding treaty of the court. The United States favors a UN Security Council referral of the entire situation in Burma, which would allow the court to address all alleged atrocity crimes being committed there. But, of course, we are cognizant that China and Russia would block any such effort. Finally, we are seeing victims and non-governmental organizations filing criminal complaints in national systems, including in Argentina and in Germany, against those deemed responsible. The case filed in Germany includes post-coup victims and survivors and members of other ethnic and religious groups, broadening the crimes that will be able to be considered by that court. Last June, with assistance from the State Department, 7 witnesses traveled from Cox's Bazar to Buenos Aires in order to give testimony about what they witnessed and what they experienced during the 2017 violence. During my own trip to Argentina, I met with prosecutors and advocates who are pursuing this case on behalf of the Rohingya in order to express our support for their work. Since 2018, all of these justice efforts have been aided by the United Nations Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, the IIMM, whose mandate is to collect, preserve, analyze evidence of atrocities committed since 2011, and to facilitate criminal proceedings in any courts with jurisdiction. Following the 2021 coup d'etat, the IIMM also is investigating post-coup violence that may constitute international crimes. Consistent with the Burma Act, which again, let me express my thanks, we continue to advance the work of this mechanism through our voices and our votes before the United Nations, with State Department funding, and by sharing information in our possession. While these justice pathways are being pursued, the United States has taken other measures concrete to promote accountability in the sanctions realm, as we've already discussed. All that said, and you've asked about what more can be done, enhanced monitoring and public reporting of the conflict could fill critical gaps to bolster accountability measures, could raise the profile of emerging and ongoing atrocity risks, and could enable the United States and our partners to craft and deploy more accurate and targeted messaging. Subject to resource availability, we are exploring how we might expand the work of the Conflict Observatory, which has demonstrated success in identifying, tracking, and documenting war crimes and other atrocities in Ukraine and now in Sudan. Notwithstanding all of these interlocking efforts, pursuing each of these pathways to justice is challenging, and as we've mentioned, the process takes a long time. The hope is that all of these efforts happening outside of Burma will someday be complemented by the implementation of a comprehensive transitional justice agenda within Burma, should the day come when that is possible. In closing, I would like to thank Congress for all of its unwavering support for these initiatives to advance justice and accountability in Burma and elsewhere in the world. Thank you, and I think we all welcome your questions.
All right, thank you very much. I appreciate. I have a few questions. I'll try to be concise and keep this moving here. Ms. Brown, will Burma be on the agenda during the upcoming UN General Assembly, and can we expect any action regarding Burma coming out of the UN General Assembly?
Thank you for that question. I think what the United States has been trying to do is ensure that it is on the agenda. As noted by some of my colleagues here, it's always balancing what we can do when we have some other members that are perhaps not as forward-leaning as we are. However, we have had some success at the UN in the past, including with that UN Security Council resolution that I had mentioned. We were pleased to see also in the past that we had India, Russia, and China sometimes abstain rather than blocking some of our actions. So yes, we're looking through exactly what that would mean. This is one of the areas where we do a lot of coordination with friends, partners, and allies, and it ranges across the board, not just those in Southeast Asia, but the UK, the EU, Canada, Japan are okay. So this is one of the things that we're in fact having a strategy session in the coming days and hoping to have some further conversations in New York next week.
Well, for what it's worth, we would welcome any action in the UN General Assembly, and if we could be wind at your back, please let us know. This is also for you. I mean, it's my understanding that Myanmar oil and gas enterprise is by far the largest source of revenue for the Burmese military. They rely on those revenues. A case can be made that denying the military this revenue could have a massive effect on the Burmese military's capacity. The EU has sanctioned the enterprise without any major adverse impacts. I mean, I'm told that some of the hesitation might be that Thailand has a heavy reliance, on this. But in any event, is there a reason why the U.S. hasn't used the authorities that? Is there any reason why the administration hasn't used the authorities given to it by Congress to sanction Myanmar oil and gas enterprise?
So thank you for that question. We certainly agree that MOGI is something that we need to address in terms of when we step back and thinking about depriving the regime of the hard currency to buy weapons and do whatever else that they're doing. As part of our strategy, we really have zoomed in in MOGI specifically, as well as jet fuel and some of the other areas that I mentioned. When it comes to MOGI, we took a very key step back in January where we sanctioned some of the leadership of MOGI. And then the second step was those state-owned banks, the two that I mentioned earlier. So I think that was one way to get at it. In the longer term, we are still moving forward on additional actions. There is always consultation with neighboring countries, including Thailand. And I will flag that, of course, they just have a new government that was recently formed. This is absolutely an area of discussion for that new government. But what we do try to do is take a step back and ensure that we're looking not only at the energy security impacts on the people of Burma and other surrounding countries, but to weigh both sides. So I can say that we continue to move forward with this line of sanctions. I don't have anything more detailed to share. I will say that when we talk to other governments, we do compare notes. I am certainly not a sanctions expert on the ins and outs, but what's key is whenever we see a partner government move forward with something, we take a step back and say, should we have already taken this action? What other evidence do we need? What else can we do? So it is certainly something that we're working towards.
I appreciate that, and again, for what it's worth, I think we would urge that stronger action be taken against them. So, but thank you for your answer. In August of 2022, Secretary Blinken promised to increase the resettlement of Rohingya refugees in the United States, and so we're told by advocacy organizations that since that promise, only 60 Rohingya have been admitted. I don't know if that's correct or not, but if it is, I guess the question would be, what plans are there to increase resettlement?
So I can, thank you for the question. So the details that I have here in front of me, and perhaps some of my colleagues can add on, since 2009, we've had more than 12,000 Rohingya resettled in the U.S. I know that we have.
Yeah, that's a good, yeah, I did, yeah.
Yes, and then unfortunately, these statistics have not quite stuck in my head, but when it comes to the plans for moving forward later this year, we already have a number of Rohingya who have already been, I guess, designated that we plan to process. I don't have the details right
Okay,
in
no,
front of me, but we're
that's
happy to
actually very
follow
good
up.
news, and so these may be old numbers that we have, so I appreciate that. And, you can follow up with us. Yeah, I think it was 60 since the promise Secretary Blinken made. So that's what
I would be happy to follow up with the
Yeah.
exact statistics, but I did see some promising numbers, including what's set aside for this year in terms of admission, so I follow.
Yeah, so I think August 2022 is
Okay.
the date that we're measuring from.
Okay.
That's right, okay? Mr. Schiffer, we've consistently heard calls for greater localization of humanitarian assistance, channeling more funds directly to local level Burmese organizations that are frontline responders and have access throughout the country. For example, via the Myanmar Local Humanitarian Network. Is that an option? Or why not? And what is the share of humanitarian assistance funds currently channeled through local organizations?
It is absolutely an option, and as you know, the administrator is a strong advocate for localization for Burma as elsewhere. Right now, we fund over 50 local organizations, either directly or through international partners, and that represents about 30% of USAID's funds that go into Burma. Obviously, we have to work very, very carefully to make sure that our partners are vetted, that they're able to meet the needs of the people that we're trying to reach. But it is something that we believe in strongly and are happy to continue to pursue.
So I do a lot of work on global food security issues. What is the food security situation, first within Burma and second in the Rohingya? I think you talked a little bit about it already in the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh, but what about within Burma?
As you might imagine, given the tremendous damage that the junta has done to Burma, the situation is fairly dire. The numbers that we have hold that about a little more than 15 million people in Burma are food insecure, and that half the population is now living in in poverty, wiping out all of the economic gains that were made over the previous decade. And of course, in Burma, as elsewhere, due in no small part to Russia's illegal further invasion of Ukraine, food prices are only on the increase. So this is a real pressing situation, and we are working both through our programming and with local partners to try to figure out how to address it. For the Rohingya population in Bangladesh, at Cox's Bazar and at Bhasan Char, as you know, USAID provides about 55% of the nutritional needs through the programming and support that we provide. The World Food Program, we've provided them about $675 million since 2017 for these purposes. Part of the challenge that we have now, and this speaks to the need for continued congressional support, is that as our ability to be able to continue to fund food security for the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh comes under increased pressure, we have a gap. And you know, our funding dropped from 120 million to 98.8 between FY22 and 23 for nutritional programs in Bangladesh. And we believe that there is now about a $120 million gap across all of the international donor community. The World Food Program, as I'm sure you're.
Yeah, no, we had a briefing by Cindy McCain about it. Yeah, we're trying to reverse that trend.
Well, we would welcome working with you on that.
Ms. Barclay, I appreciated that you highlighted the escalation in the military's use of gender-based violence. How does this reality affect DRL's programming, and what kinds of proposals are survivors of these violations putting forward when it comes to fulfilling their rights to truth, justice, and reparations? And are there specific accountability initiatives for victims and survivors of gender-based violence?
Thanks very much for the question. It's a really important one. I mean, I think what I would say is the prevalence of sexual violence is so pronounced in this conflict that almost all of the programming that DRL does has some gender-based violence aspect to it, whether it's transitional justice, whether it's journalist training, support to civil society. So it's a fundamental part of the programming that we do.
And can you say anything about the situation of the LGBTQ plus community in Burma? I mean, how are their rights and their well-being being affected by the war?
Thanks very much for the question. I mean, I think as in many places, and certainly in many conflicts, the most marginalized people are the most at risk. And that is certainly the case in this context. I'm happy to go back to the team and get specifics
Okay.
on LGBTI issues if that's something in particular.
That would be helpful, yeah. Thank you. Ambassador Van Schaak, what efforts are underway to ensure accountability, specifically for the military's use of rape and sexual violence? I mean, are there specific accountability initiatives for victims of and survivors of gender-based violence?
So, as I mentioned, there are these multiple pathways to justice happening before the various courts. In the ICJ, it's the general charge is one of genocide, but we have seen before other courts and tribunals that gender-based violence can serve as an underlying act of genocide when it's committed with the intent to destroy a protected group in whole or in part. So I imagine that the Gambia will be including claims and allegations by Rohingya women and men who have been subjected to sexual violence, gender-based violence. When I was in Cox's Bazar, I did meet with some survivors who had experienced this themselves, and they were adamant about the need to have justice for this harm. Before the ICC, it's potentially a more limited set of charges that can be brought because it requires this nexus to Bangladesh, which is the state party to the ICC statute. But acts of deportation can be spurred by coercive measures back in Burma. So I imagine that many individuals have fled across that border, thus culminating the crime of international deportation because of their fleeing sexual violence and other gender-based violence. So I imagine that that will be a part of that, those cases as well. And then these cases proceeding before individual courts in Argentina, in Germany, there are clients, there are plaintiffs within those matters who have also experienced gender-based violence. So I imagine that each one of these pathways to justice may shed a stronger light on that phenomenon.
Yeah, and just one final question, and I'll turn it over to my co-chair. Obama and Trump and Biden have all had different approaches in terms of the support for ICC situations. And I think given the Biden administration's more, I guess, permissive ICC policy, Secretary Blinken's determination that the Burmese military committed genocide and crimes against humanity against Rohingya, and his statement that he would support a potential UN Security Council referral to the ICC for the situation in Burma, which is an acknowledgement that this ICC investigation is in the U.S. national interest. Will the U.S. now agree to support the ICC's existing and ongoing investigation into Burma?
Yes, thank you. As I mentioned, this administration really supports justice and accountability for this matter, building upon that historic atrocities determination that was made at the U.S. Holocaust Museum last year. It's quite a moving set of remarks. I reread them just in preparation for this hearing, and I was really struck by the points that you note. We are looking for ways to support all of these pathways, whether it's through our voice and our vote, through funding, through information sharing. You will have seen in the press that there was some concern within the interagency about supporting the Ukraine matter. That has now been resolved, and so I think we're now in a position to consider a request for information if one were to materialize.
Thank you. This has been very helpful, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much. To my good friend, the chairman, I have a few questions, and I thank you for your testimony and for your leadership. Maybe first to you, Mr. Schiffer, Assistant Administrator. With regards to the assistance that's being provided to the refugees, you said there's about 1 million. Are they getting an adequate amount of food, clothing, and shelter? What happens as people make their way across the border? What does the junta do when they apprehend someone? And others might want to speak to that. And you mentioned 1.9 million IDPs. How hard is it to get life-saving humanitarian assistance to them? I know you're using every modality you can possibly come up with. And if you could give some insight as to what the psychosocial intervention might be for people. Is it more found in the refugee setting? How do you really deal with people who are suffering so immensely? PTSD is probably to be found on almost everyone, especially the children and other vulnerable people. So maybe you could elaborate on that for a moment as well.
Thank you. That's those are very, very important issues that you raise. It is exceedingly difficult, as I know you appreciate, for us to be able to reach many of the IDPs, the internally displaced people inside of Burma. The military places, excuse me, places travel restrictions. They have not allowed humanitarian access in Rakhine State, for example, since June, and obviously, as many of the places that we need to be able to reach to be able to address the needs of the internally displaced people are active military conflict zones. It is a very, very challenging operational environment. We do our best with our local partners and with others in the international community to be able to provide cross-border assistance creatively, often in low-profile ways. And frankly, we do our best with humanitarian principles first and foremost in mind, and with an approach of no discrimination to reach those in need, to go in through the front door as well, where and when the military authorities allow that to happen. It's a tricky balancing act to make sure that we do not provide them with any legitimacy, but our moral obligation to be able to reach those in need, obviously, is also foremost in mind. In terms of the psychosocial services that we provide, that is primarily in the refugee settings, both in Thailand and in Bangladesh. And it is really, as you put it, trying to reach the full scope of needs, given the deep trauma that many of these refugees have faced from the violence, from sexual assault, and other abuse that they have faced.
Is there any financial shortfall with regards to the refugees? Is there something you can't be doing, like food or medicines, because of a lack of resources?
I will be happy to come back to you with more specific dollar figures in mind. It is, of course, there is always more that we can do, particularly given the scope and the scale of this crisis. As I mentioned, we've identified about a $120 million gap for nutrition assistance for the Rohingya refugee community in Bangladesh. But there is certainly more that we could be doing if the resources were available.
Ambassador Van Schaick, the Gambia initiative, what is the timeline for that, and what might be a possible positive outcome of it?
The ICJ proceedings are generally quite lengthy. It has moved more quickly than we have seen in terms of imposing provisional measures, which is essentially like a preliminary injunction in a domestic context, basically ordering the Myanmar government to cease and desist in all of the actions, to preserve evidence, et cetera. Of course, the Myanmar government has not necessarily responded to those provisional measures. Their counter memorial, their counter brief was just due recently, and it has been filed, as our understanding. It's filed under seal, so we're not able to review that. So we're now on the papers, essentially, but it will move forward at the pace that it will move forward at, and it's hoped that more Rohingya refugees will be able to come and testify. Some have gone to The Hague for the earlier hearing. So we're tracking that very closely, looking for other ways that we might assist. I will say that the Gambia has hired private lawyers to represent them, and that does not come without a cost. And so that's why the support of OIC members is critical, and we're making that part of our bilateral and multilateral relations with the OIC members to thank them for the support that they're giving to little Gambia, who has stepped forward and is articulating its rights under the Genocide Convention as a full and equal member.
Secretary Barclay, with regards to human trafficking, is the trafficking intra-country? Is it inside the boundaries of Burma, or are there people, whether it be in China or anywhere else, part of a network where these children and women are being sold into modern-day slavery? Okay. That would be great. If you could, we'll make it a part of the record. I look forward. Anyone else, perhaps, on that one? Okay, no, I understand.
I think we will also contribute to what we will provide as follow-up. I'll say, unfortunately, from what I'm aware of, it's both. And I think one thing stepping back is, because of the situation on the ground, we do have a really amazing embassy staff, Americans and people of Burma alike who work at our embassy. But the fact that they're not able to travel and talk to as many of the same people and get out there and track down information, it's just so much harder for us to track these sort of important issues, and we've had to modify the way that we do collect that sort of information. So I do want to make note that we appreciate that both American and Burmese are working so hard at our embassy to do the best that they can, but it does limit the access to information. But again, we will contribute in the follow-up.
Appreciate that, because in addition to the exploitation of those vulnerable people, it's a moneymaker, and the junta could find a way of making a significant amount of money by engaging in that nefarious enterprise. The final question, obviously the G20 just took place. It was in India, we all know that. India, Russia, and China continue to be major arms suppliers to the junta. And I'm wondering, I looked and did not find, I could have missed it, in the G20 communique, whether or not there was any statement on Burma and about from arms sales to, or flows to other problems with the junta. We know India is a supplier of those arms. Did it come up? Was it discussed? And was there any hope that it would be included, as I think it should have been, in the communique?
Thank you. In terms of what was discussed specifically at the G20, I'll have to follow up, and I'd be happy to get back to you. I can flag that in terms of sale and transfer of arms, that's one of the channels of international diplomacy that we've really been pushing, not just through the UN, but also bilaterally across the board. That includes the dual-use technology, which, often some quiet engagement with some governments. And because, thankfully, we have many, many stakeholders who are very focused on this crisis, when independent and other reports are put out, sometimes we're able to play facilitator in the sense of having those private conversations, ensuring governments are aware of what's being circulated, and encouraging strongly for them to take heed in case that they are involved, whether overtly or not. I will say that when it comes to the UN Security Council, the question earlier related to the UN, the arms issue is something that we would like to draw greater attention to in the UN context. So I think hopefully we'll be able to focus more in the coming week with all the events in New York on that issue.
With total respect,
Yes.
it is disappointing that the G20 statement, I know it was issued with Modi right there, and he was a part of it, how incredibly powerful that would have been to speak to the arms issue and other issues vis-a-vis Burma, human rights, of course, had it coming from that platform.
Yep. Well noted, and we'll follow up on
I
that,
appreciate
sir.
it. Thank you. I yield back.
We're joined by Congresswoman Ilhan Omar.
I want to start by thanking the co-chairs for holding this important hearing. It is critical that Congress keep a critical eye on the situation in Burma. Last year, I was honored to be invited to take part of the International Parliamentary Inquiry on Myanmar, which was an ASEAN initiative bringing legislators from around the world together to hear testimony from victims, from civil society, political leaders, and formulate recommendations on how best to address the situation after the coup. I also recently returned from Ecuador to Indonesia, where we met with ASEAN's special envoy for Myanmar. And I want to tell you the same thing I told them, and the same things that I've said here on the floor of the House last year. I think it is right for the United States to recognize the National Unity Government as the legitimate government of Burma. And I also think we must only consider the NUG to be a legitimate body if it includes significant and meaningful Rohingya representation. We should not in any way legitimize coup leaders, but we should also not ignore the genocide against the Rohingya and the pressing need for Rohingya reintegration into the Burmese government. Ms. Berkeley, earlier this year, and I know it was just addressed, Secretary Blinken finally made the designation that genocide has occurred in Burma. What are the practical implications for the U.S. policy of that designation? Let me start, and then I'll ask maybe my colleague
Make sure your mic's on.
I'm just not anti-mic, I swear. I mean, one of the things those designations always do is what I would say is give oxygen to the movement of keeping a situation on the international agenda. And I think that it adds legitimacy and credibility to what the international community is calling out about what is happening on human rights in Burma. And so I think from that perspective, it's quite important. As Das Brown was saying, it's similar in this context. Other countries will look to us to take the lead on those types of designations. And while it may be hard to provide a direct measure of what the impact is of our making a determination, I have seen time and again in various country situations where that type of leadership matters to other countries to lift the veil for them to feel as if they can come forward. But in terms of legal process or other ways you see it, maybe you can add to.
Yeah, Ambassador, before you answer, I know that in some of your responses to my colleagues, you talked about the cases in front of the ICC and the ICJ, and you obviously praised the Gambia, which is really incredible that the small country was the only country in the world to step up. And you talked about some of the challenges in regards to resources. What resources is the United States ready to provide to the Rohingya case? And in regards to the financial challenges, like having a firm, lawyers, and that kind of thing, I know that the last time we talked to the ambassador for the Gambia, they were asking for direct financial support, maybe absorbing the cost of the firm. Is that something that the United States is ready to do?
Wonderful, thank you. Just to follow up on my colleague's remarks on the significance of the determination, it doesn't necessarily have legal determination in the sense that it would be binding on any tribunal that might look at it, but they would certainly give it, I think, great weight, particularly because the United States government, through DRL, funded a very important multidisciplinary study of refugees in Cox's Bazar. So this was not just based upon reading newspaper articles, right? They actually went to the community, they interviewed individuals, they took their testimony, and they were able to look very carefully at the indicia of genocide, not just the types of harm that individuals were experiencing, because we know genocide is not just mass killing, it's also the imposition of conditions of life and severe mental and physical harm, but also those indicia of that genocide intent, which is what sets genocide apart from other international crimes. And so I think because it was such a careful determination, it will carry great weight before some of these tribunals. And we are in a position to be able to potentially share some of that underlying information because it was produced through non-governmental partnerships and experts from the field. In terms of your question and resources, our primary support, besides all of the civil society support that we've discussed, has been to the IIMM with this International Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. 2 discrete grants of $1 million have gone to the IIMM, one to work on witness protection issues, which will help with some of the psychosocial concerns that were addressed earlier, but also enabling those individuals to participate safely in justice processes and to resettle as necessary. Another $1 million grant went towards open source investigations because they too have no access to Myanmar itself. And so they're left dealing with refugees, with individuals who have left the country otherwise, with doing remote investigations and also collecting open source information. There have been a number of defectors who have left and who have been able to bring documents out. And we have supported some of the organizations that are working with those individuals to try and make that information available. We have not done direct financial support to the Gambia. It's certainly an interesting idea, and the OIC has clearly done so, and so it's something we can certainly take back and try and advocate internally if resources were available.
Wonderful, thank you. Ms. Brown, I know that you get to have more conversations probably with the special envoy, the ASEAN special envoy for Myanmar. What is your assessment of their position here, and how can we encourage them to be stronger on the issue?
Thank you for that question, and I'm really glad that you had the opportunity to meet directly with the special envoy's office. I guess one of the benefits of ASEAN being the chair this year was seeing greater leadership on this issue. Not only did they have a person designated, they created a whole special office that gave resources, because we all know one person who has a separate day job doesn't give the same heft as really having dedicated staff and a team. One thing that I really admire the Indonesian special envoy acting on behalf of ASEAN as a collective, but also as Indonesia, the chair, is the way that they've really leaned into doing engagement with the pro-democracy movement across the whole spectrum. And when I say that, I'm talking about not only the National Unity Government, but also, as we mentioned earlier, Rohingya, but there are many other ethnic, religious, women's rights, just so many different types of stakeholders who are looking for a cohesive, inclusive pro-democracy movement. I think Indonesia, frankly, has been disappointed that they weren't able to drive forward more progress on the 5-point consensus. And I have been reminded by some of my ASEAN colleagues that while they support the United States and other dialogue partners, holding up ASEAN as one of the keys to resolving the crisis, that ASEAN does not want to operate alone, that they require the UN and the United States and others to really step up and engage. Looking to next year, Laos will take the ASEAN chair. So we're trying to do some early work as the United States, but also with other dialogue partners, speaking to ASEAN as a collective, speaking to ASEAN member states separately, of how can we ensure that some of this momentum continues. I am unaware of the final decision, but I did hear that there were some who were advocating for more of a troika approach, where you would take the previous chair, Indonesia, the current, or soon-to-be current, Laos, and then looking for the chair the following year, and perhaps making more of a team approach to ensure some more continuity on some of the progress.
Because there is worry that
There-
once
well,
Laos becomes
yes.
the chair, that the progress that has been made will not continue to be.
Yes, in addition to being less perhaps vocal and forward-leaning on ensuring that Burma is held accountable and forced to make progress on the 5-point consensus and not get legitimacy within ASEAN, there's also just the practical staffing capabilities that Laos is a much smaller country with less capacity. So that's one of the things that we're working on in ensuring that we can provide the assistance that we can. But I mean, ASEAN is always a process. I will say I was particularly pleased to hear that when the vice president was in Jakarta, that ASEAN did decide that Burma could not hold the chair. It's Myanmar in the alphabet, so they're coming up in terms of chairing quite soon, and that opportunity was denied. I think again, it may seem as a small step, but it would be a huge complication for how the U.S. would engage ASEAN, not only on Burma but on all sorts of issues, but also would give them great credibility. So it's something that we'll continue to work and ensure that we can support the best we can, sometimes behind the scenes.
If I may, one last question. Mr. Schleifer, how is the USAID balancing the urgent humanitarian needs in the country with the important desire not to work with the junta? And we're also hearing some human rights violations in the refugee camps in Bangladesh. How are those being tracked, and what's your assessment there?
On the first issue, I mean, it is, as we've had the opportunity to discuss a little bit already today, it is a careful balancing act between making sure that we are reaching the people that are in need in Burma, particularly the internally displaced population of about 1.9 million, and those, particularly in the ethnic states that are coming under increasing violence and attack from the military, and be able to provide them with life-saving humanitarian assistance, and obviously at the same time making sure that we neither give legitimacy to the military, and that we make sure that none of the assistance that we provide benefits directly or to the extent that we can indirectly the military. Those are two red lines for us. So we are constantly working with our partners in the international community to advocate for greater humanitarian access, and then also working with our partners, both our international partners and our local partners, to figure out when and where we can, how we make sure that we meet the needs of the people in Burma that are facing extraordinarily dire circumstances. Sometimes that has to be done in very, very low-profile ways, as I'm sure you can appreciate, but we are constantly pressing the edge of the envelope of creativity in that regard. In terms of the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar and Bhasan Char, and I will also defer to my colleagues from state if they want to add, we are aware that there are reports of human rights violations as well as other criminal activities. I mean, perhaps not surprising, not to excuse, but not surprising when you have this mass of refugees living in really terrible circumstances, despite our best efforts to meet their needs. So we are working with both the NGO community that service the camp, our international partners, and the Bangladeshi government to make sure that wherever we hear about these incidents, that we are making sure that we are documenting them in the same way that we do with our State Department colleagues for any reports of human rights violations and working within the confines of the justice system that is available in those camps to make sure that the victims receive justice and then also receive medical, social, psychosocial, and other support that they may need.
Well, thank you very much for being with us for so long. I appreciate your testimony and your expertise, and we look forward to working with you further in the future. So you are free to go. Thank you. Our second panel is Tom Andrews. He is the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar, a former member of the U.S. Congress from Maine. Mr. Andrews has run national advocacy organizations, including Win Without War and United to End Genocide. He is the director of the Maine Studies Center at the University of Maine and served in the Maine House of Representatives and in the Maine Senate. We are happy to have you here again. And just make sure your microphone is on, and
Yes, sir.
And then the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman McGovern, Chairman Smith, Congresswoman, thank you so much for attending and being part of this important session and being part of this very important commission. It is very important that you're holding this hearing for three principal reasons. One, because Myanmar is out of sight, out of mind for most of the world. It has become invisible. Secondly, because conditions in Myanmar have gone from bad to worse to horrific. And thirdly, because I believe that Myanmar is now at an inflection point, and that the actions of UN member states to support human rights now could be decisive for the people of Myanmar. And I also believe that no single nation is better positioned to move this action forward than the United States. It has become increasingly clear to me that the junta has not only failed to put down a widespread resistance across the country, but it is losing ground. It has responded to losing ground through increased aerial attacks, strikes on civilian targets, including villages, schools, hospitals, and encampments for displaced people. And you've heard about those horrors in this committee, so I'm not going to go over the horrible statistics. But let me just tell you that as the UN Special Rapporteur, I have the opportunity to speak with people directly who are on the front lines of this tragedy. I've talked to parents who have lost their children, who have been abducted and tortured. I talked to a dad whose two daughters, only two daughters, were killed in an airstrike on an IDP camp, I've talked to parents whose children were abducted because the junta was trying to get to them. I've talked to teachers and physicians and nurses and reporters who have been incarcerated and tortured for their commitment to basic principles that this commission believes in. Mr. Chairman, conditions for the Rohingya ethnic minority have deteriorated both inside and outside of Myanmar. More than 1 million have been forced into overcrowded, squalid camps in Bangladesh, prohibited from working, and with very limited educational opportunities for their children. Rohingya families have seen their food rations cut by a third. They must now figure out how to survive on 27 cents per day. Even before the cuts, 40% of Rohingya children were suffering from stunted growth, over half anemic, and yet we've reduced their meager rations even more. This is scandalous. With life in Bangladesh untenable and returning to Myanmar unthinkable, last year more than 35 Rohingya sought to escape by putting their fate into the hands of seafaring smugglers. Hundreds perished. And when I was in Indonesia a short time ago, I met with some of the lucky ones who survived, and they told me that people are already making preparations and lining up to put their fate into the hands of smugglers because of how bad conditions are. A smuggler's boat sank just a few weeks ago, killing dozens, and I am very concerned that we're going to see a significant increase in the number of those boats, the number of desperate people, and the number of people who are going to perish at sea. So what should be done? First, the United States should provide the requisite humanitarian aid for those who are struggling to survive both inside and outside of Myanmar, and help to mobilize support from additional states. While the junta severely restricts the distribution of life-saving aid within Myanmar, civil society organizations have developed very sophisticated networks that can get aid to where it is needed. What they lack are adequate levels of support, and we must do better in supporting those organizations. Support is also needed for those from Myanmar who have been forced to flee to neighboring states. The Rohingya Humanitarian Response Plan, or JRP, which you've been discussing, it includes food rations for Rohingya children in Bangladesh. That fund is only 32% funded up to this point this year, and I am alarmed by reports that some donors, including the United States, may likely reduce their level of support for this fund this year. Mr. Chairman, the situation is truly desperate, and it's why I've been traveling to UN member states throughout the region and the world to push for stronger, life-saving support for the JRP. But as we push for nations to step up and take responsibility that they have not taken, those who have stood up and provided resources, like the United States, must at least maintain their current level of support. Now, the best way to address the escalating need for humanitarian aid is to stop what is driving the need for humanitarian aid, and that is the junta and its war on the people of Myanmar. And the best way to do that is to deny the junta the three things that it needs the most to sustain itself: weapons, money, and legitimacy. First, weapons. As I documented in a special report that I issued just a few months ago, the billion-dollar death trade, more than $1 billion worth of weapons have been transferred to the military since the coup, notwithstanding the evidence that these weapons are almost certainly going to be used to commit war crimes and kill and assault innocent people. The junta has continued to purchase the jet fuel that allows its jet fighters and helicopter gunships to attack villagers in increasing numbers. Second, money. The junta has been able to sustain itself by seizing the assets that rightfully belong to the people of Myanmar. Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise, Mr. Chairman, a state-owned entity, supplies more than $1 billion to the junta every year, and the junta has also been exploiting Myanmar's riches in timber, in jade, and in gemstones. The junta sees its large military as a source of strength, and indeed, it cannot survive without it. But it is also a source of weakness, because it takes significant amount of money to feed those troops, to supply those troops, to get those sophisticated weapons up and running. So they are vulnerable in this area, and we should be exploiting that key vulnerability. Now, as you heard from the administration just a few minutes ago, critical progress was recently made when the United States took the highly significant step of imposing sanctions on the Myanmar Foreign Trade Bank and the Myanmar Investment and Commercial Bank in June. I think Secretary Brown called it a bullseye. It was a bullseye, but it needs to be the beginning. There are other bullseyes that we need to be targeting. There's other action that we need to be building on, not just check the box, we've done this. We need to build some momentum in this direction. It's critically important. The junta has relied on these two banks to purchase weapons and repatriate revenues into Myanmar. Following this decision, as an example of the impact that it's having, Singapore and Bangladesh froze, banks in Singapore and Bangladesh froze junta-linked accounts holding millions of US dollars. That is highly significant. We need to build upon that. We need to have more sanctions imposed. We have to facilitate greater international coordination to squeeze the flow of this revenue and these weapons. Finally, legitimacy. Earlier this year, I published a report that demonstrated the fallacy of the junta's claims to be the legitimate government of Myanmar. The good news is that the majority of democratic governments agree and have withdrawn diplomats, disinvited junta officials from multilateral meetings, and engaged with the legitimate opposition national unity government. The bad news is that a few ASEAN members, along with some other governments, have been seeking to reintegrate junta officials into high-level regional meetings. This week, the junta's mouthpiece, the Global New Light of Myanmar, reported that the junta will be receiving support from Russia from what it described as election activities, a reference to its plans to orchestrate what it will try to convince the world will be an election. Mr. Chairman, I would like to take this opportunity to commend U.S. Ambassador to the UN Human Rights Council, Michelle Taylor. Ambassador Taylor continues to be a strong, consistent, and principled advocate for human rights for the people of Myanmar and the world. It is an honor and a pleasure to work with her. But, Mr. Chairman, to answer your question, we can and we must do more. I urge the U.S. to join the European Union and immediately impose sanctions on this junta's single largest source of revenue, Myanmar oil and gas enterprise. I urge the U.S. to continue to target the junta's access to international finance by expanding and enforcing sanctions on state-owned banks and working with regional partners to ensure that they can't evade these sanctions. And I urge the U.S. to work in coordination with others to block the junta's access to weapons, materials, and jet fuel while denying it any opportunity to claim legitimacy, including by declaring any attempt by the junta to hold an election to be what it will be, a fraud. To conclude, Mr. Chairman, the crisis in Myanmar is at an inflection point. The people of Myanmar continue to show remarkable courage and resolve to defend their country and their children's future from a brutal, illegal military junta. Some UN member states have chosen to take action that legitimize and support the junta. Others have chosen to stand with the people of Myanmar by denying the junta what it needs to sustain itself: money, weapons, and legitimacy, and by providing incredibly important humanitarian aid to those victims. But more must be done, and done now. I applaud this commission for holding this hearing and shining a light on this crisis. I commend you and your colleagues for passing the Burma Act as part of the National Defense Authorization Act at the end of last year. I encourage you to appropriate robust funding to fulfill the goals of the Burma Act, including the provision of non-lethal support to the democratic opposition. Finally, I implore you to support robust levels of humanitarian aid to the junta's victims, both inside and outside of Burma. The world is at a crossroads with the crisis in Myanmar. The United States, more than any other nation, is in a position to help turn the tide with coordinated action that adds up to a powerful whole. I urge this commission to actively support timely action, because for the people of Myanmar, it is literally a matter of life and death. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for all you do for human rights. You answered a lot of the questions I was going to ask, but let me, just for emphasis, you recommend that the U.S. should join the EU in opposing sanctions on the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise. And we heard from the administration that they're looking at that and looking at options. But that's what, you know, we'll see what, I don't know what that means. But the bottom line is, for emphasis, I just want you to repeat and elaborate on why this would be such an important step to take.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's important because it's the largest source of money that's fueling the junta. Follow the money. If you can stop the money, you can cut their ability to continue these atrocities. So let's start with one of the single largest sources. The EU has done it. And here's another very important point. We need to coordinate these actions. It's important that we step in a positive direction in some of these things, but we need to link them together. So sanctions against Mogi, great, the EU has imposed it, but others need to follow, and the United States certainly among them. It's the single largest source of money.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there was some chatter that one of the reasons why they weren't was because it might adversely impact U.S. allies, but the EU has done it, and to the best of my knowledge, you know, the impacts to our allies hasn't been an issue. So it would seem to me that, as you point out, I mean, given this is the largest source of revenue for the military, you know, that should be a target.
Mr. Chairman, the junta is able to rely upon certain powerful friends for money, for weapons, who are not bashful about providing those resources. I think it's really important for those who are standing with the people of Myanmar to take actions to just reverse that, to undermine their junta's ability to buy these weapons by cutting this source of revenue and other sources of revenue.
And for the record, do you have access to Burma? Are you able to travel to or within the country?
No. I have access to the people of Myanmar thanks to communications technology. I'm in communication with them on an ongoing basis. It makes the horrible statistics that we talk about very, very real and very, very tragic and very, very heartbreaking. But I'm not allowed into the country.
And in your statement, you recognize the importance of the coordinated actions taken to date to target the military's access to jet fuel. What are the prospects for going further, for getting an arms embargo in place or otherwise further restricting the flow of arms to the military? I mean, what are the principal obstacles that that need to be overcome for that?
Well, we need to enforce these actions that we take, and we need to broaden and deepen them. We've already seen some very tangible results. So I issued a report early this year, my first report on weapons, in which I identified Serbia as being one of the sources of weapons to the junta, coming in at number 3 behind Russia and China. Serbia has subsequently announced that they will no longer authorize the transfer of weapons to Myanmar. We identified in the most recent report 138 different entities based in Singapore that are involved in the transfer of weapons, materials that are going into Myanmar to produce into factories that are producing weapons in Myanmar. The Attorney General of Singapore and colleagues, including in customs, have launched an investigation to that report. I was in Singapore to meet and work with them, and this is the kind of thing that we can be doing more of to support those countries that have links. Now, to be perfectly clear, Singapore was not aware before this report that this was going on. They certainly were not engaged in this trade. And so they responded by saying, let's get to the bottom of this and move forward. The United States is in a critically important position to help them and other countries like them to pursue this.
Thank you. Co-Chair Smith.
Thank you. And thank you very much to you, Mr. Andrews, for your leadership, your report, your very, very strong and powerful testimony this afternoon. Just a couple of questions. You mentioned Russia and China as arms exporters to the junta, and Serbia. That was a very good point you made, that they have now backed off. Where does India come in that listing, and what other countries are either a source of origination of weapons or a transshipment country?
Well, Mr. Chairman, we continue to research those sources. Certainly, as you point out, Russia comes in at number 1. China came in at number 2. And Singapore, through these 138 entities, came in at 3rd. India has also been a supplier of weapons and weapons technology. We've identified that as a matter. But this is another important point to make. I have been criticized roundly by some, including in the General Assembly and in the Human Rights Council, by Russia and China for vilifying what they describe as normal arms trade. But India, to its credit, has responded. They have met with me. They've worked with me. I've been providing them with additional information. They're very engaging and very responsive. So and again, the same goes with Singapore. So we have sources of weapons, weapons technology, and materials, but we have varying degrees of responsibility being taken by various countries that are involved in this trade. We need to keep the pedal to the metal to stop this trade altogether.
Let me just ask you, I did ask the last panel about the G20 lack of focus at all in terms of, and maybe there were private conversations, I do not know that, but there certainly wasn't anything in the communique that I saw or read. And I'm wondering if you think that might have been a missed opportunity. Again, in their search for legitimacy, the junta certainly takes note that, the G20 was very, very close, proximity-wise, and said nothing about their barbaric and egregiously cruel behavior. It seems like it was a missed opportunity. Would you agree with that?
I think that every opportunity, every public opportunity should be seized.
So was that a missed opportunity?
Well, I think that among others. I mean, I don't want to, there are other.
That was the most recent, just happened.
There are other forums, G20 among them. There are G20 countries that have been very supportive, that I've had the privilege of working with. But I believe in every instance when a group of countries come together to engage in a range of issues, including economic related issues, that it is a missed opportunity not to focus on this crisis, and that we should be as an international community more vocal. And this not only helps in terms of the pressure on the junta, but also it helps in terms of the hope for the people of Myanmar, that they're not alone.
Let me just ask you, during the wars in the Balkans, Lukashenko was a provider of material and weapons to Serbia. And I'm wondering, is that one of the nations that's on your list, or are they just focused on Ukraine?
They not to my knowledge, they're not on the list that we've been pursuing.
Okay. Let me ask you about the jet fuel. Where is that being processed? Who's that coming from?
Well, there are a number of sources.
Okay.
And it's enabled to, and to understand the jet fuel, there's the actual fuel itself, there's the processing of the fuel, and then there's the distribution of the fuel. And it comes in and by the way, we're pursuing this in a study right now in which I hope to be able to provide you with some additional details. But it includes the transportation of this fuel, it includes the insuring the fuel. It includes the financing of businesses that are connected to the processing of that fuel. And I think what we need to do, and again, the United States can be taking a stronger role in identifying all those linkages to jet fuel, and there are many, and sanctioning them, making it clear there is a price to pay to aid and abet these jets and these helicopter gunships massacring innocent people.
In the previous panel, I did ask Mr. Schiffer if he would get back to us as to what the unmet financial need is for the refugees and for the IDPs. You talked about 32%. That's all it has been funded. I guess that's for the refugees. Did I get that right?
That is the Rohingya Humanitarian Joint Response Plan, and the food rations are within that plan. But it's $876 million, 32%. To this point in the year, and it's September, only 32% have been funded.
Now, you talk about the stunting. The UN has a great program. We have a great program about the first 1,000 days from conception to the second birthday, that if children and mothers get enough nutritional aid, it almost wipes out the issue of stunting, and cognitive abilities are not impaired for the rest of that child's life. Is there an effort to try to bring that emergency sense of, getting the first 1,000 days? I know food for everyone is important, but obviously in that first 1,000 days, if you don't have it, your ability to think and reason will be severely impaired for the rest of the life.
That's right. That's right. No, that's right. And this is going to have lifelong impact. These are the key developmental years of these children. And I'll tell you who's doing something about it. Their parents. I've heard of parents going without food so that they can provide their children with food. And remember, we're talking about 27 cents per day. 27 cents per day. It's just absolutely tragic and unspeakable. This is really a horrible situation that is completely unnecessary.
Women who are pregnant, are they getting any kind of prioritized care in your estimation?
They are also not getting the nutrition and the care that
both they and their child are being hurt.
Precisely. We have, for example, we know that women who are both pregnant and women who are breastfeeding, more than half of them are anemic.
Let me, two final questions. The National Unity Government, the shadow government, that how hidden are they? I mean, if they in any way show their their presence, it seems to be that they're hauled into prison and abused horribly. How do they communicate without, how do they stay viable?
Well, they have a variety of ways.
I mean, some are already outside the country, which is
That's right,
good.
that's right. They have a variety of ways of networking and communicating. They are the legitimate, Congresswoman, as you pointed out very clearly, they are the legitimate government of the people of Myanmar. They were elected by the people of Myanmar. But not only that, what they have done is they have reached out in a very, very systematic way to the various ethnic communities throughout Myanmar to incorporate them into the process of having a government that is truly inclusive. Is it perfect? No. Are there more steps that need to be taken? Yes. But with respect to the Rohingya, there have been a clear declaration that the Rohingya deserve full citizenship rights, full human rights, and a representative of the Rohingya community has been appointed to the cabinet of the National Unity Government as the Deputy Minister of Human Rights. So steps are being taken by the National Unity Government, but relatively speaking, particularly with respect to this, the junta, which I think probably it's easier and more accurate to think of them as a criminal gang that has basically taken the country hostage. And you have entities like the National Unity Government working very hard to seize the country back.
Final question, you mentioned some of the ASEAN countries looking to reintegrate the junta. Can you name those countries?
Well, there's been what is called track 1.5 diplomacy for that talks that have gone on. The outgoing or the government that has the previous government of Thailand, for example, was involved in track 1.5 diplomacy, and there are others who would be more inclined to that, except countries like Indonesia have been very, very clear that ASEAN needs to be standing on principle and making sure that the junta does not have a seat, at least at the table of the highest echelon.
Are you optimistic that Laos will, I mean, just yesterday, they renditioned a number of people back to China, and one of the political prisoners that I've been speaking out on behalf of were very concerned. He wasn't among that group as far as we can tell, but they cowered to the forced extradition requests of Beijing, and I'm just wondering if, can we have hopes that the Laotian leadership will be good?
Well, we have to have hope. And I think part of the pragmatism of ASEAN is to coordinate the incoming chair, to link them with the outgoing chair and the chair that will be coming in after Laos. So you have Indonesia outgoing, and you have Malaysia incoming, so that the three of them will be working together so that there'll be a more clear and consistent path forward. And I think that was a very good move. Absolutely.
Congresswoman Omar.
Thank you so much, Mr. Andrews, for your advocacy and for your speaking so passionately about this issue today. Just to go back to some of the countries, it is my understanding, and it was my understanding when I was there speaking with the envoy and others, that the government of Laos is in favor of incorporating the junta into like ASEAN, right?
Well, let me share with you.
I mean, it seemed like there was a lot of anxiety from the heads of Indonesia that the progress that they've desperately worked for would be undermined because the upcoming chair does not has a more favorable opinion, and obviously, countries like Vietnam and Thailand and others also do. It's my understanding.
Well, but it's not only within ASEAN. Other countries have been linked and linking to those that are trying to provide legitimacy to the junta, trying to incorporate them. So I am hesitant to single out any particular country with respect to this question, particularly until they have a chance to demonstrate.
You're the diplomat here, so it makes, it makes sense. Well, we'll move on. I know that, more than anyone here, you know the role that Congress can play in improving U.S. policy towards Myanmar. Is it your view that we should be looking at additional legislation to propose, or is it more of an implementation of the Burma Act that you are imploring us to do today?
I think anything that can happen, that can push this envelope, some of the recommendations that I've made, reflecting them in resolutions, incorporating them as amendments in legislation. I think the appropriation is going to be critical. It's one thing to talk the talk, but if you need the resources to walk the walk, particularly in the areas that I've described. So I think in all of those areas, Congress can play a very, very important role. And obviously, it will be a challenge here on Capitol Hill, but it's a fight worth having, and it's a debate worth having, because lives are at stake. And I would encourage Congress to not only take those kind of action amongst yourselves, but also to link, as you have been linking with others around the world. I've had the privilege of meeting with parliamentarians from a number of countries where I've traveled. And I think that there are ways that collaboration on the level of parliamentarians, members of Congress, can also help to push the envelope and give this greater visibility, this crisis, the visibility that it deserves.
Yeah. I would say it was interesting participating in the international parliamentary hearings, because obviously time zones are a thing, and waking up 5 in the morning to do hearings and hear about just the tragedies that people have been through was an experience that I won't forget. And one of the actual recommendations that we made is something that you just spoke to, is the sanctioning of the oil and gas. My concern, and you know this about me, I hesitate every time I hear sanctions. That's my least favorite S word. How do we, in your view, how do we do that and mediate the humanitarian impacts that the civilians in Myanmar would experience?
It's a very important question, and I ask that question a lot to people on the ground. Mm-hmm. They tell me that the economy has been destroyed, not by sanctions, but by the incompetency and the negligence of this junta. And this goes on for many, many years. That's the root of the problem. And what they've described to me as the way forward is to intensify the pressure, intensify the sanctions, so that this can get over sooner rather than later. Because once it's over, once they have finally lost their grip on those institutions that are responsible for so much suffering, the sooner they can put their lives back together. Remember, one of the earliest sources of sanctions were citizen sanctions imposed by the people of Myanmar, boycotting anything and everything connected to the junta and any of its businesses. So that's what they're telling me, and I think that they're right.
Yeah. And my last question, Chairman, if I may. You talked a lot about losing grip, and obviously, most of us want to see a civilian-led government. We want the national unity government to be legitimately recognized. Let me see if I can phrase this. What is it that the United States and the international community can do to do that, to strengthen them, to overcome this hold that the junta has?
Provide them with the resources to survive.
Like what?
Humanitarian aid, for example. Support to CSOs that are on the front lines working with them. Support for legitimate entities like the National Unity Government and others. I think we need to stop the killing and do everything possible to stop the weapons that are flowing, but then also targeting those that are aiding and abetting those weapons, including financial institutions and other institutions that are allowing this to happen. And use every ounce of leverage that we might have, and we have. The United States has significant leverage, I've learned. The people of the world who I speak with, and I work with, I'll be speaking to the General Assembly in a few weeks. The United States is in a very, very important position to demonstrate leadership and resolve, and also to provide coordination to make sure that all of these actions add up to a powerful, coherent whole. I think we can do better that is, the United States can do better in that regard. And I think that that could really help to make a significant difference in turning the tide for the people of Myanmar.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here and for sharing your expertise. And we now will move to our third and final panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ai Chan Mun is a medical doctor and native of Myanmar. She graduated from the University of Medicine, Mandalay, in 2020, just before the COVID-19 pandemic. After graduation, she joined the Ministry of Health as a civil assistant surgeon. Due to the political coup in Myanmar, she courageously joined the civil disobedience movement from the beginning. And despite difficulties and challenges, she helped in the telehealth care services for 2 different townships, providing online medical assistance while hiding within the country for her own security. She eventually sought safety in a border area with the help of the United States Embassy, where she continues fighting for the democratic movements of Myanmar and stands with the voiceless. Myanmar people who are now suffering from the atrocities committed by the Myanmar military junta. Lucky Karim is a Rohingya refugee, women's rights activist, humanitarian worker, and a survivor of the Myanmar junta-led genocide. In 2017, she was forced to flee her country, Burma, Myanmar, and she has worked for a number of humanitarian organizations while she herself was a refugee in Bangladesh Cox's Bazar camp. She spent 6 years in a refugee camp and in December 2022 found a home to live life in the United States of America. We are thrilled that you are both here. You can begin, and welcome.
Good afternoon. Sorry about that. Good afternoon, co-chairmen and the honorable members of the Lantos Human Rights Commission. My name is Ai Chan Mun. I am a medical doctor from Myanmar, which is also known as Burma. So thank you very much for granting me this opportunity to be here and serve as the witness to testify about the atrocities committed by the Myanmar military against its own people. I consider myself fortunate enough to have been evacuated and provided with the opportunity to live in a safe place thanks to the US government. But it is essential to acknowledge that there are millions of people whose life and well-being remain in grave danger inside the country. Before the military attempted the coup, my life was happy and promising. I had finally achieved my lifelong dream of becoming a medical doctor and a government employee. I was excited and proud to be able to help the people in my community. However, in the early morning of the February 1st, 2021, national TV channels announced that the military had taken control of the country power by overthrowing the democratically elected leaders and activists. For the people of Myanmar, the military coup cannot succeed. Our past experience had taught us that it will mean no hope for the future. When the millions of people rose up to show their resounding rejection of the coup and the peaceful protests erupted in the country, I joined and became a part of the civil disobedience movement, which is also known as CDM. So the military generals started their brutal crackdowns instead of listening to the people's will. I witnessed the military use a real bullet against the protester for the first time in Naypyidaw, the capital of Myanmar, when they shot a 20-year-old girl named Nyatotwe Khai in the head. She was the very first victim of the military terrifying crackdown in 2021. So as a doctor, it was hard to watch the military hurt, tortured, and killed innocent people. The coup destroyed all the progress in the healthcare system that we had been making. The Myanmar military withheld COVID vaccine and oxygen tanks from the people to stop the revolution. Consequently, thousands of patients were not treated in the government hospitals. So to fight in our own way, our medical professionals organized teleconsultation for the patients and provided emotional support to their families. But we faced many challenges because the military made it difficult to access the necessary medical supplies and facilities. Sometimes we had no choice but to watch our patients dying in front of our eyes. So the future of the education system is the same. CDM students, they are still continue to refuse to go to schools, enter the military's education, which pushes the lies and propaganda of the military regime, and the restrictions on information made it almost impossible to learn the truth. So despite all this oppression, we established self-education with ethnic-resistant organizations, international communities, and with the help of Myanmar people abroad. We are experiencing an unprecedented level of cooperation among all diverse ethnic communities in countering the military junta. Meanwhile, if the patient involved in providing services get caught by the Myanmar military, they are arrested and labeled as terrorists. Their human rights violations have not stopped there. There are airstrikes and bombings on the civilian villages in the ethnic control areas and Burmese majority regions. This is the same military who has been committing crimes on its own people for several decades. And the effect on me were direct. My colleague, who was a CDM nurse, was spent alive only because she was providing medical services to the internally displaced person when the military raided their village. So there are many cases what my friend went through. And the innocent people have been arrested, women have been raped, and then children have been killed. So I want to see these military criminals to be taken to the court and be held accountable for the crimes against humanity and the war crimes. Justice must prevail in my country. As long as the military stays in power, atrocities and human rights violations will continue to take place. And the people are now lacking protection and the security. All kinds of humanitarian aid, such as shelters, food, water, as well as education and mobile medical facilities are needed urgently for survival. But it is most important to end the military dictatorship at all costs. And I speak not only for me, but also from the hearts of our people in my country. We really appreciate the US government for passing the Burma Act. Now, urgent implementation of the Burma Act is crucial at this moment to relieve the suffering of our people. And we also welcome more sanctions on Myanmar military officials and state-owned banks. But I would like to urge the US government to consider imposing sanctions on Myanmar oil and gas enterprise, because by doing so, this will save many lives and will offer hope for the future of the young generation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ms. Grimm?
To speak about this situation is both inside and outside Burma. My name is Lucky Karim, and I'm a Rohingya refugee from Myanmar. I was forced to flee my home in August 2017 after genocide and crimes against humanity and against us Rohingya by the Myanmar military in Rakhine State. My whole family fled to Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, where 1 million Rohingya refugees now live in impoverished camps. The Myanmar military regime has been persecuting the Rohingya in Myanmar for decades to people like myself. Since the military coup in Myanmar in February 2021, the political, economic, and humanitarian crisis in the country has only grown more dire for the Rohingya, as well as other ethnic minorities in Burma. Dictatorship is a notorious problem in many countries. Dictators take away the freedom of people in the name of their own power. They attack people's hopes and dreams. My family and I had to live in the Bangladesh refugee camp for more than 6 years before we had an incredible opportunity to resettle in the US in December 2022. During our time in the Cox's Bazar camp in Bangladesh, conditions steadily worsened. Rohingya children and youth have extremely limited access to formal education and no livelihood opportunities at all. People lack clean water, a healthy environment, and more than half of the Rohingya refugees are not safe in Cox's Bazar camp, including community leaders and educated women. So far, we learned from the daily update of my people, at least 300 Rohingya individuals were killed by the non-state actors, and many more have been kidnapped or taken away in camps. And now, the donor funding for the humanitarian response is decreasing. Recent food ration cuts by the World Food Program are having devastating consequences. The unlivable conditions in the camp and the reductions in food allowance has pushed many vulnerable Rohingya families to embark on dangerous boat journeys in search of a better future. Most intend to reach Malaysia by sea, where there are much better conditions for refugees and more rights. But this means risking their lives on tiny boats for weeks. Unknown numbers of people have not survived the journey. The refugees in Bangladesh are also being compelled into engaging in illegal activities. And vulnerable Rohingya women are being kidnapped and taking risks by themselves to travel to neighboring countries like Malaysia. The people of the Rohingya community live vulnerable and stateless in many countries all over the world. Families have been separated for decades, and many live with no identity documents in the countries where they reside. Our risky journeys out of Myanmar in pursuit of better lives did not start when the genocide against us peaked in 2017. People have been fleeing persecution since at least the 1970s, forced to be refugees in Bangladesh or elsewhere. These dire circumstances are forcing a few impoverished families to consider going back to Myanmar under the pilot repatriation project that is now being mediated by China. Repatriation to unchanged, unsafe conditions in Myanmar, where we still have no rights, is not a real solution. Our people understand this and must be consulted in every decision-making process about repatriation and our collective future. Shockingly, no Rohingya person has ever been involved at a political level in ongoing repatriation discussions between Myanmar, Bangladesh, the UN, China, and other actors. Refugees should have their own rights to choose when to go home. The decision to repatriate cannot be left in someone else's hands. We, as a people of Myanmar, know our situation better than anyone else. We know that repatriation is not possible, safe, or sustainable as long as the people who still live in Myanmar are not safe there. The Rohingya community always wants to be repatriated. In fact, nearly every one of us is desperate to go home. But we can only return when everything is stable. We must be able to return to our original land and ancestral values. We must be recognized as a rightful citizen of Myanmar. Our identity and rights must be respected. But today, these needs are not at all fulfilled. The military junta still avoids recognizing the Rohingya and has said clearly that returners will be forced to live in encampments, not real homes. These places are nothing more than concentration camps. In this moment, we are so grateful to the US for recognizing Rohingya as genocide survivors. But that recognition was only the beginning of a journey toward real progress. We want the US to continue working on our issue and to feel responsible for the betterment of the stateless Rohingya community. In the short term, we see that the international community is not reacting appropriately to the Rohingya situations in the Bangladesh camps. We need your involvement to make sure we can live peacefully while displaced. The humanitarian response needs sustained funding to ensure life-saving assistance, including food, health, education, and safety in the Cox's Bazar camp. Looking forward long-term solutions, any dialogue and actions taken about our issue should not be only led by China. We want more participation from the US, the United Nations, Bangladesh, and international countries who care about human rights. Most of all, like any people, we Rohingya need a voice and a role in making decisions about our own future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Co-Chair Smith.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Regrettably, I do have to leave, but I do want to say I'm on a live television show, and I apologize. But let me just say how you said it best, I think, Ms. Karim, that you know your situation better than anyone else. And you know, we listen carefully, Doctor, we listen to you very carefully. You prescribe what our next step should be. You are courageous and just amazing witnesses bearing witness to the crimes against humanity that you talked about, Doctor. I mean, they're ever present, and we will do everything we can. It's great that Jim and I are co-chairs. We believe deeply in the cause of the people of Burma. I've chaired hearings myself going way back. He has chaired many hearings. And Tom Lantos, after whom this commission is named, had the first important piece of legislation become law, the Burma Jade Act in 2008. And he was as articulate and as persuasive and aggressive as it gets. So we're all in this. It's bipartisan. I'm Republican. My good friend Jim is a Democrat. Doesn't matter one bit. We're all for it. I think it's worth noting that Beth Van Scheck is still here. She, I know everyone has busy schedules, but she wanted to stay to hear, and I think to hear you, because she obviously is in charge of global criminal justice and does a wonderful job. So thank you for that great courtesy. And we're always learning. And I think the idea, as was mentioned by the Special Rapporteur, that we're at an inflection point. We need to triple down on our efforts in a bipartisan, bicameral, and with the executive branch and with our friends throughout the world. So again, your words are heard by all of us, and God willing, we will act effectively. I thank you, and I thank my good friend.
Thank you very much. And I have a few questions, and I hate to do it. I just got to note that this room is going to be used for another hearing, in a very short time. And it's a long story, but in any event, but if I could just maybe ask you to be as concise as you can, just so I want to get this in, and maybe we may follow up with some written questions. But Doctor, are you able to update us on the situations of political prisoners and the well-being of IDPs in Burma?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for bringing up the topic of the situation of the political prisoner. To me, they are true heroes since the beginning of the revolution, because who stand unwavering in defense of human rights and democracy. And it is hard to imagine the situation of people behind the bar and how they are treated by the soldier and the military officer, especially when their incarceration is as a result of their political belief and actions. Since the beginning of the coup, the military has carried out a campaign of mass arrest and detention, and they have taken more than 24,000 people in custody, and around 20,000 people are still in jail across the country. So some have simply vanished without any evidence of their whereabouts. Among those unlawfully detained political prisoners are our President Wu Win-myint and the State Councillor Daw Aung San Suu Kyi. And then there are so many other well-known activists and leaders. And then one of my seniors, who is the brightest student in the medical school, has been detained in the prison because he tried to share his medical knowledge to the communities who had to flee to jungles and ethnic control areas. So once the people are taken away by the junta, they are subjected to unspeakable horrors such as torture, sexual violence, and other inhumane abuses. And they are denied proper trials and are treated like animals by the soldiers and military officials. And the detention center and the interrogation centers can be described as a living hell in Myanmar. Political prisoners has been losing their human rights and dignity, and they are forced to do hard labor and they're put in the overcrowded cells in the prison, and that they don't receive enough food and medical care they needed. And the detainees are not only physically harmed, but also denied family visits. So the families themselves enjoy immense emotional pain, and they need psychosocial support. So it is crucial to emphasize, despite attempts by the junta to deceive the world with false claim of pardoning a few political prisoners or reducing minor sentences, the situation inside the prison remains in danger. And then to talk about the IDPs, after the military's brutal crackdown on the peaceful protesters countless number of youths and adults were forced to flee to the jungle and join ethnic resistance organizations. So this led to the widespread expansion of the resistance movement throughout the country, and that the conflict between the Myanmar military and the local resistance groups has resulted in displacement of the millions of people within the country. And then the ITPs including elderly individuals, pregnant women, and young children have to abandon their houses and their belongings and fleeing in various locations near or far from their original places. The temporary shelters and schools established for the ITPs and even the camps they live in have repeatedly under attack by the military soldiers through airstrike, bombings, and the arson, because they have falsely accused of that local resistance forces are hiding among the IDP camps. And furthermore, the IDPs living in the forest area are now facing the threat of malaria and other life-threatening illnesses, such as dengue, diarrhea, skin infections, and other communicable diseases are outbreaking. And the deteriorating the health condition within the overcrowded camps are very serious. The escalation of this health problem is primarily attributed to the lack of access to the essential supplies and medical care. And the food security has also become a major issue in some regions. The distribution of food and other necessaries remain inadequately funded and insecure. And the poor transportation made it harder. As a result, people have to share whatever provision they have and demonstrating the resilience and the solidarity of the affected communities. Despite all these challenges, our people are tirelessly committed to deliver aid to those who are in need through the support of our people inside the country and abroad. However, the people who still remain in the major city are now enduring the adverse effects of the inflation because of the poor economic management of the Myanmar military. So immediate deployment of humanitarian responses to the ITPs and the political prisoners are very crucial at this moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Ms. Karim, if I could just ask you quickly, what are the top 2 or 3 things that the Bangladeshi government must do to improve the living conditions of the Rohingya refugees?
Okay, so to just briefly answer your questions, and this is a really important question that I have been answering to many people in the state. It is also a great moment to thank them for hosting our people for more than 10 times already, not just starting in 2017. They welcomed our people since the 90s almost. But it's not just, they welcomed us and allowed us to shelter in their land, but it didn't just stop the genocide, it didn't just stop the problem there. It's just the beginning of our safe production and a life towards the journey. So while hosting our people, they have to feel responsible for the security situations in Cox's Bazar. They should know who the killers are, and of course, should allow refugees themselves to talk to other countries who care about the human rights, and should allow refugees to seek legal protections from other countries. And more importantly, there are no safe houses in Bangladesh for refugees. So some of the safe houses are owned by the UNHCR, and it's only for a very few number of people who are at risk and cannot any longer live in the refugee camp, and they have to stay in a hiding place. But there are now safe houses from the government side to the risky family in the Cox's Bazar. So there are thousands of families and individuals who cannot even sleep at night in their shelters with their family in Cox's Bazar camp. So Bangladesh government should feel responsible for those people and of course, respect the human rights violation in the most risky situations for them.
And before people come through this door for the next hearing, let me just ask you, make sure I want to get you both on the record. I mean, I think you both believe that it would be appropriate for the United States to join the EU in imposing sanctions on the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise. Am I right? I mean, do you think that would be an effective tool for us to impose at this particular point?
I think, so as usual, we are always grateful to US, but then, however, nothing has yet enough done. I would say we actually need more and more involvement from the US side, not just for repatriation, but for every situation that people have been through in Cox's Bazar or inside the Burma. The question is not about the repatriation. We don't care about the repatriation. Anybody can repatriate us. But the question is, who is responsible for the human rights violation after the repatriation?
Right.
That's what we need. So this is the reason we need continuing involvement from the US side as well as from the international community until everything is stable inside the country, not during the repatriations.
And let me answer your question. Yes, I believe if the U.S. government involved in sanctioning Myanmar oil and gas enterprise, it will help and save so many lives in my country, because the MOGE is the only main source of the revenue that Honda can buy weapons from the foreign countries. So if the U.S. government impose sanction on MOGE and enforce that sanction effectively, it will save many lives.
And let me just close by saying, I really want to thank you both for being here. We may follow up, if that's okay, with some written questions.
Sure.
But I just want you to know why it's important that you're here, and the previous panels, is because, I think there's a lot going on in the world, and I think, the people responsible for human rights violations in Burma, I think, are hoping that we will be distracted and not be focused on what the realities are that you have described very, very succinctly and passionately. But we're holding a hearing in the United States Capitol on this topic, and I think there's a lot of, commitment by the people up here, to follow through on some of the recommendations. And I think that you have highlighted, some realities that maybe people who are watching this, that it's being live streamed or whatever, may not even be aware of. And so this is all very, very important. The key is for us not to give up and not to lose focus. And I think that's kind of the message I'm hearing. I also want to thank you both for your courage and for your bravery. And I will look forward to a continued collaboration. Let's hope and pray for a better day for the people who have suffered so terribly. So again, I apologize. We have to bring the hearing to an end right now. I have 1,000 more questions, but I don't run this place, and there's another, and there's a little bit of a mini crisis happening on the floor. So anyway, but thank you so much, and that ends this hearing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.